When you close your eyes tonight, I want you to imagine stepping into a medieval chamber. The walls are of cold stone, the air heavy with the faint smoke of tallow candles, and in the center of the room stands a great wooden bed draped with rough linen sheets. The flicker of firelight makes the shadows dance across carved beams, and though this is meant to be the most joyous evening of a woman's life, it feels instead like the beginning of a trial. Before we move deeper into this journey, let me pause for just a moment. If you enjoy drifting into history, told slowly, carefully, and with a sense of wonder, please take a second to subscribe to Sleepy Story. It helps me bring you more of these quiet explorations into the past, and it is always heartwarming to know where in the world you are listening from. Now, let us continue. For a young bride in the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely about love. It was an alliance, a contract, a negotiation between families. Behind the ceremony and the feast lay expectations that were far heavier than any crown of flowers placed upon her head. The proof of her purity was demanded, and that proof had to be shown in the most intimate and terrifying way: the consummation of the marriage on the wedding night. The day began with celebration. There was laughter, wine, music of lutes and flutes, tables heavy with bread and roasted meats. Yet as the sun set and the guests drifted away, the mood shifted. The bride knew that soon she would be led into a chamber not just to sleep, but to be inspected by custom and by eyes that were not even present in the room. For when morning came, the sheets would speak louder than she ever could. Imagine the weight of that fear. Many of these brides were barely more than girls, some as young as 12 or 13 in noble families, where alliances had to be sealed quickly. Their knowledge of what awaited them was vague at best, often pieced together from whispers, rumors, or stern warnings. Mothers rarely explained the details, fearing it might taint their daughters with sin even to speak too openly. So the young bride walked into the chamber with dread, her heart pounding louder than the bells of the village church. The groom, too, was bound by expectations, but his role was not judged with the same cruelty. If he was clumsy, impatient, or even violent, blame seldom fell upon him. The responsibility for proof rested almost entirely on the woman. A bloodstain on the sheets was demanded as evidence of virginity, and without it, her reputation, and by extension her family's honor, could collapse in an instant. In some noble households, servants or witnesses were even stationed outside the chamber door. They listened for sounds, they waited for the moment, and in the morning, they inspected the sheets. This act, both humiliating and invasive, turned the most private moment of a woman's life into a public trial. Imagine the terror of knowing that strangers would be judging the fabric that had absorbed your pain. But what if the bride did not bleed? Many women, for perfectly natural reasons, did not show blood after their first intercourse. Perhaps the hymen had torn earlier through riding, work, or even simple chance. To the ignorant eye of the Middle Ages, however, the absence of blood was not biology. It was guilt. It was shame. It was an accusation of impurity. A bride in this situation could be cast aside, beaten, or even annulled. Some were sent back to their families in disgrace, their futures ruined not by their choices, but by the cruel demands of tradition. The pressure was so great that families sometimes resorted to desperate measures. There are records of mothers hiding vials of animal blood beneath the bedclothes, ready to smear onto the sheets if nature failed to provide the expected sign. Others whispered prayers or charms, begging saints for mercy on their daughters. The very survival of a woman's standing in her community could depend on such fragile tricks. Now picture the physical surroundings. The bed was not soft. It was a heavy frame with ropes or boards beneath a straw-filled mattress. The linens were coarse. The air was cold. Privacy was nearly impossible in households crowded with relatives, servants, and attendants. Every sound carried through thin walls. The young bride lay there trembling, her body stiff with fear, while the weight of custom pressed upon her. Some grooms were gentle, patient, and kind. Not all medieval men were brutes, and there are accounts of marriages where affection grew slowly after that first difficult night. But others treated it as their right, an act of dominance rather than intimacy. In regions where the so-called droit du seigneur, or jus primae noctis, was rumoured, the supposed right of a lord to sleep with a bride before her husband, the fear was doubled. Though historians debate how often this was truly practiced, the very belief in it haunted imaginations, adding another layer of dread to an already terrifying night. For noblewomen, the stakes were political. A marriage might decide the fate of lands, wealth, or alliances between kingdoms. For peasants, the stakes were survival. A woman cast aside could find herself destitute, without protection, shunned by her neighbours. In both cases, the wedding night was less about two hearts joining and more about a ritual that society demanded, regardless of the individual's feelings. Think also of the spiritual fear. The church loomed large over every aspect of medieval life. Priests preached about sin, purity, and the sacred nature of marriage. A young bride, having absorbed these sermons since childhood, often felt torn between terror of the flesh and duty to God. To submit to her husband was expected, but to feel desire was sometimes condemned. This contradiction left many women confused, ashamed, and spiritually anxious as they entered that bed. And so the wedding night became a crucible, a test not just of a woman's body, but of her soul, her family's honor, and her future. Few other moments carried such weight, such potential for both survival and ruin. The stone walls of the chamber held countless whispered prayers, muffled cries, and trembling silences. Behind the laughter of the feast, behind the music of lutes, lay this darker truth. For many women, the night they were meant to become wives was the night they most feared. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the silence of a medieval bedchamber at dawn. The air is chill, and the only sound is the crackling of a dying fire. Outside the door, servants whisper, waiting for a sign. Not a word spoken by the bride or groom, not a vow or a blessing, but a mark on a piece of linen that would determine whether the night had been honorable or shameful. Before we journey further, I invite you, if you find yourself drawn into these slow and thoughtful explorations of history, to subscribe to Sleepy Story. It helps me continue to bring you these immersive narratives, and it is always a quiet joy to see where in the world you are listening from. Now, let us step back into the Middle Ages. In the medieval mind, virginity was not simply a personal matter. It was a currency of honor, a symbol of family pride, and the foundation upon which alliances were built. A woman's body was considered her family's most fragile possession, and her wedding night was the moment when that possession was tested. The proof: a bloodstain. The belief was straightforward but merciless. When a bride gave herself to her husband for the first time, her hymen was expected to break, releasing blood. This blood, seen on the sheets the next morning, was treated as undeniable evidence that she had been pure. If the stain was absent, suspicion fell instantly. Families whispered, husbands doubted, priests frowned. A missing mark of blood could bring ruin. In noble households, the ritual was public in its consequences. The morning after the wedding, servants would sometimes carry the sheets into the great hall, displaying them before assembled relatives and guests. The linen, still marked with traces of intimacy, became a banner of honor. The family of the bride beamed with pride, knowing that their daughter had kept herself. The groom's kin nodded in satisfaction, reassured that the marriage had been properly sealed. The sheet was sometimes even preserved, folded and stored as proof in case disputes ever arose. Imagine the pressure upon the bride. After a night already filled with fear, she knew that her private body would be judged by fabric, by stains she could not entirely control. The weight of family honor lay not in her words, not in her heart, but in whether a single drop of blood appeared where tradition demanded it. But nature is rarely so obedient to custom. Many women do not bleed at first intercourse. The hymen is delicate and varies widely. Some are stretched or broken through childhood play, riding or labor long before marriage. Others are elastic enough to stretch without tearing. In the modern world, we understand this clearly, but in the Middle Ages, biology was often misunderstood, and superstition filled the gaps. To medieval families, an absence of blood was rarely seen as natural. It was interpreted as evidence of sin. Whispers spread. Perhaps the bride had been with another man. Perhaps she was impure. Perhaps she had deceived them all. Even when the bride swore her innocence, even when she had never so much as touched another, the doubt lingered. And doubt, in an honor-driven society, was poison. Some families took precautions. A mother might prepare a small vial of blood from a chicken or a pig hidden in the bedclothes. If the bride failed to bleed, a careful hand could smear the sheet to create the appearance of purity. It was a desperate trick, but one that could mean the difference between survival and disgrace. Others relied on charms or prayers, beseeching saints to grant their daughters the sign that would preserve their standing. But still, countless women faced the cruel chance of biology betraying them. A single absent mark could undo years of reputation, turning joy into humiliation. For the bride herself, the knowledge was crushing. She lay awake through the night, aware that her body was being measured not only by her husband's gaze, but by an invisible tribunal of family, neighbors, and priests who would judge her in the morning. The bed became an altar, the sheet a scripture, and her body the unwilling sacrifice. The symbolism of blood went beyond purity. In the medieval imagination, blood was sacred. It was tied to sacrifice, to covenant, to salvation itself. Christ's blood shed on the cross was preached as the ultimate proof of divine love. So too, the shedding of a bride's blood was cast as proof of her virtue, her loyalty, and her family's honor. Without it, the marriage seemed unblessed, unsealed. In some regions, songs were sung about the bloodied sheets. In others, laws were written that allowed a husband to annul a marriage if no proof of virginity was found. And always, the burden fell on the woman. Her husband's past sins were irrelevant. His purity was never questioned, but hers was demanded, inspected, and judged in public silence. Consider what this did to love. True affection could be crushed beneath suspicion. Even if a husband cared for his new wife, doubt could fester. The absence of blood could plant seeds of mistrust that grew for years. And in a world where women had little recourse, even the suspicion of impurity could isolate them, strip them of protection, or lead to cruel punishment. And yet, life is never so simple as custom demands. Some husbands ignored the expectation, choosing kindness over tradition. Some families dismissed the absence of blood as chance, but these were exceptions. For most, the ritual was rigid, unyielding, a cold mirror of how deeply women's bodies were bound to the honor of men. As you let these images settle in your mind, think of the countless brides who trembled through their wedding night, not for themselves, but for the stain on a sheet that would decide their fate. Think of the heavy silence in the chamber at dawn, the creak of the door as the linen was carried away, the collective breath held as eyes searched for proof. The truth is that for many medieval women, honor was not a feeling, not a deed, but a mark demanded in blood. And whether it appeared or not, their lives were forever shaped by the expectation that purity must be visible, no matter the cost. The flickering glow of torches cast long, trembling shadows against the rough-hewn stone walls of a medieval chamber, where the air itself seemed thick with expectation. Outside the chamber, families gathered, whispering, waiting, their ears straining for signs that a ritual as old as memory itself had been fulfilled. Inside, two people lay upon a bed layered not with silken sheets, but with scratchy linen and the weight of centuries of tradition. The pressure did not come only from the bridegroom, but from an entire community whose sense of honor was measured in something disturbingly tangible: blood. For in the Middle Ages, the very fabric of a family's dignity was woven into whether or not a new bride could prove her chastity on her wedding night. It was not enough to stand before a priest, to swear oaths, or to exchange rings. No, society demanded a physical token, a crimson stain upon white cloth, the mark of virtue itself. Without it, a woman's life could collapse into disgrace and ruin. And so, for countless brides, the wedding night was not an evening of intimacy, but a trial, a test staged before an audience of unseen judges who listened, who waited, who expected proof. Imagine the young bride, scarcely more than a girl, trembling as she approached this night. Raised from childhood to guard her virginity as if it were a fortress wall, she understood the consequences should the expected sign fail to appear. Her parents' reputation, her husband's pride, and her own survival all hung in the balance. Virginity was not simply a private state of being. It was a public currency, a seal of purity that determined whether alliances between families held firm or fell apart in scandal. The first marriage bed was not a sanctuary of tenderness, but a courtroom, and its verdict was decided by the presence or absence of blood. For medieval society, this expectation had deep roots, tangled in religion, medicine, and superstition. The church preached that chastity was the highest state a woman could embody before marriage. The hymen, an anatomical mystery poorly understood in those days, became a sacred signifier, a supposed barrier broken only by the rightful husband. Physicians and clerics wrote treatises describing virginity as though it were a lock, intact, until opened by marital consummation. The breaking of this seal, they believed, produced inevitable bleeding. And so, the logic followed. If there was no blood, there was no virginity. The science was flawed, of course. Modern knowledge tells us that bleeding is neither inevitable nor universal. But medieval families clung to this belief with a fervor that shaped laws, customs, and fates. Consider the ritual itself. In some noble households, the wedding night was not entirely private. Servants lingered outside, prepared to collect the sheets as evidence. In certain regions of Europe, the stained cloth was triumphantly displayed the following morning, hung from windows or carried aloft in processions, a public proclamation of the bride's honor and the groom's success. Imagine the humiliation then, if the sheet remained unstained. Whispers would spread like wildfire through the village. Was she impure? Had she betrayed her family? Or worse, had the groom failed in his duty? Either way, suspicion poisoned reputations, and the woman bore the brunt of the shame. The obsession with proof turned wedding nights into staged performances rather than intimate beginnings. The bride was expected to endure pain, to bleed, to suffer, and to produce tangible evidence of her sacrifice. Without this suffering, her value diminished. It was as though her body existed not for herself, but for her family's standing in the eyes of society. Honor was fragile as the belief in a drop of blood. But what of those brides who did not bleed? Their plight was perilous. Some turned to desperate measures. Stories survive of women pricking their thighs, or using small vials of animal blood hidden within the bedchamber to stain the sheets when nature refused to cooperate. Others relied on sympathetic maids or midwives, who might secretly prepare the cloth beforehand, ensuring the ritual would be fulfilled no matter the truth. These acts of deception were dangerous, for discovery could lead to accusations of fraud, annulment of marriage, or even violence. For men, too, the stakes were high. A groom who failed to consummate the union faced ridicule and dishonor. His family might lose valuable dowries or alliances. Kings and nobles sometimes demanded inspections or trials to confirm a marriage's legitimacy, particularly when inheritances or political treaties were at stake. In such cases, the bride's body became a battlefield where dynasties rose or fell, where politics invaded the most private of human experiences. Imagine the terror of a queen, newly wed, knowing that the future of nations might rest on whether her wedding sheets bore crimson proof. Beyond the halls of nobility, the practice seeped into peasant life as well. In villages, the morning-after display of blood-stained linen became a spectacle, an entertainment almost, where neighbors judged and gossiped. Honor was not reserved for kings and lords. Even the humblest family guarded it fiercely, for a daughter accused of impurity could destroy marriage prospects for sisters, cousins, and generations to come. Shame was not contained. It spread like wildfire, scorching entire lineages. Religion fanned the flames further. Priests thundered from pulpits that female chastity was a divine command, that a woman's untouched state mirrored the Virgin Mary's purity. To marry without it was to invite sin upon the household. In their eyes, the blood of the wedding night was more than biology. It was a sacred sacrifice, an offering that sanctified the union. Failure to produce it was not only social disgrace, but spiritual failure. Some texts even likened the red stain to Christ's blood on the cross, proof of suffering, proof of sacrifice, proof of covenant. In such a worldview, how could a woman who failed to bleed ever be accepted? And yet, not all was as rigid as the laws and sermons proclaimed. In secret, in whispers, midwives and wise women knew the truth, that not every virgin bled, that the body was unpredictable, varied, and not easily reduced to simple signs. Some counseled brides in quiet tones, advising them how to feign the expected proof if necessary, or how to soothe the shame should the evidence be absent. These women became quiet protectors, shields against a system stacked mercilessly against their sisters. Their wisdom, often dismissed as superstition, was in reality a form of rebellion, a way to preserve dignity where society sought only to judge. For the bride herself, the experience was a crucible. Imagine her lying awake the night before, heart racing, prayers spilling from trembling lips. She was not only preparing to meet her husband, but to submit her body to the scrutiny of all who would judge her afterward. Her honor was not hers alone. It was her family's, her lineages, her communities. The pressure was suffocating. Even in moments where tenderness might have bloomed between husband and wife, the looming demand for proof cast a long, dark shadow. Love, desire, and companionship were secondary to a stain on a sheet. Over time, these customs left scars on culture itself. Tales and ballads, court records and chronicles, all carried the echoes of this obsession. Some women who failed to provide proof were cast aside, abandoned, or accused of infidelity. Others, falsely accused, were forced into humiliating trials or condemned to cloisters. In every case, the absence of blood was equated with dishonor, a cruel equation that left no room for compassion or truth. And yet, even within this oppressive system, stories of resistance flickered. Women who outwitted the expectations, who survived without proof, who built marriages despite initial scandal, remind us that human resilience often finds cracks in the walls of tradition. These rare voices whisper across centuries, testaments to the fact that even in times when society demanded blood, some found ways to reclaim their dignity. As the candlelight fades in our imagination, we are left with a sobering truth. Medieval marriage was never simply about love or companionship. It was a stage where honor, reputation, and survival were acted out in flesh and blood. The obsession with proof reveals a society terrified of uncertainty, desperate to control what it could not fully understand. In that desperation, it placed unbearable burdens upon its daughters, turning the most intimate of nights into a public trial. The crowd outside has gone silent, but the tension in the small chamber is suffocating. The couple lies in bed, not to rest, but to perform a duty that the entire household, sometimes even the entire village, expects them to complete. This is not intimacy. This is a public trial dressed in private clothing. For the bride, the weight of centuries of expectation presses upon her. She knows that if blood does not stain the linen beneath her, whispers will spread like wildfire. Perhaps she is not pure. Perhaps she has already given herself away. Perhaps her family deceived the groom's family. None of these suspicions require evidence beyond that linen sheet. One glance at its blank surface, and reputations can collapse. To prevent such humiliation, many families placed an elder woman, often the bride's mother or aunt, just outside the chamber door. She would listen, sometimes even intrude to verify, waiting for the sign that honor had been preserved. If, by dawn, no blood appeared, that elder might slip inside with a hidden needle. A discreet prick of the bride's thigh or finger could stain the sheet just enough to fool those waiting outside. The ritual was not about truth. It was about survival. But not every bride was so fortunate. In countless cases, women were dragged from their marriage beds when the expected proof was absent. Trials could follow, overseen by priests or magistrates who demanded public explanations of private acts. Some brides were forced to undergo invasive examinations, humiliating procedures that reduced them to specimens rather than human beings. Others were returned to their families in disgrace, marriages annulled, dowries seized, and futures destroyed. Imagine the groom in such a moment. For him, the pressure was not much lighter. He was expected to perform on command, to claim his bride physically and leave visible proof. Failure to do so might brand him impotent, unworthy of his family's name, or even cursed. Some men resorted to violence, not out of passion, but desperation. The blood spilled was not always from a hymen, but from torn skin, bruised flesh, or a forced act carried out with the weight of social obligation. In this twisted economy of honor, suffering became evidence of virtue. Medieval law codes across Europe reveal the depth of this obsession. In parts of France and Germany, witnesses could be summoned to testify about the wedding night. Not the act itself, but the outcome. Was there blood? Was the sheet displayed? In England, noble marriages were sometimes left unsealed until proof of consummation was presented. Chronicles describe bishops, lords, and even kings demanding to see the stained fabric, as though honor could be reduced to a red mark upon white cloth. Not all families relied on brutality or deception. Some turned to medicine, or what passed for medicine at the time. Midwives prepared herbal mixtures that could cause light bleeding when applied before the wedding night. Others recommended inserting small slivers of animal bladder filled with dye or blood, which would burst during intercourse. These crude contrivances show how far people would go to align with expectation. It did not matter that the blood was false. What mattered was that honor was visibly intact. The church, paradoxically, both fueled and complicated this obsession. On the one hand, it demanded purity before marriage, teaching that chastity was the highest form of female virtue. Priests preached that the bride must arrive at her husband's bed as untouched as the Virgin Mary. But on the other hand, the church was also wary of superstition. Theologians debated whether blood was truly necessary as proof of virginity, since not every woman bled upon her first intercourse. Still, these cautious voices rarely reached the common people. The myth was stronger than the truth, and it governed lives with ruthless authority. Consider the fear that lived within a young bride's heart. She may have been pure by every measure, but what if her body betrayed her? What if no blood came? She would face shame, punishment, and perhaps abandonment. Her worth, her family's reputation, even the alliance forged by the marriage, all hung on a fragile thread of biology, one that could easily fail without fault of her own. The injustice was immense, but in a world ruled by appearances, fear carried more weight than fairness. By the 14th and 15th centuries, entire ceremonies had grown around this ritual. Some villages in southern Europe required the bride and groom to hand over the sheet the morning after. Servants would carry it outside, displaying it to neighbors gathered in the courtyard. Cheers erupted if it bore the crimson mark. Mutters spread if it did not. In certain noble houses, the sheet was not merely displayed, but preserved as an heirloom, locked away in chests as proof that the family's honor had remained unsullied. A daughter's body became an archive, her pain a recorded testament. Even literature of the time reflected this cruel fixation. Ballads and poems speak of brides who prayed not for happiness but for blood. Stories told of cunning women who used pigeon's blood, or even drops from their own pricked fingers to satisfy the demands of honor. These tales were whispered as warnings, half caution, half instruction. They reinforced the idea that love was secondary, while spectacle was paramount. And so, the medieval wedding night was not a night of tender beginnings. It was a performance, a test, a trial by blood. A single stain could elevate a family's name for generations. The absence of it could destroy fortunes, unravel alliances, and condemn a woman to lifelong disgrace. That is why, when people of the Middle Ages spoke of honor, they so often spoke of blood, because in their eyes, without it, there was no truth, no purity, no trust. only shame. The village wakes as if an invisible bell has tolled, not for prayer, but for judgment. Smoke drifts from low hearths, carts groan over stones, and the well becomes a stage where whispers gather. In every doorway, faces lean out to read the day's verdict, in the way servants hurry, in the way mothers clasp keys, in the way fathers pretend to repair harness buckles while watching the manor steps. Mourning after a wedding never belongs to the couple. It belongs to the crowd, to custom, to the hard grammar of proof. Inside a dim chamber that smells of tallow and crushed lavender, a young bride sits on the edge of a creaking bed. The linen has been folded once, then unfolded, as if the fabric itself must be convinced to remember. Her hair still holds the shape of yesterday's braids, pins removed in haste, strands clinging to her neck. Near the hearth, an older woman, kin, midwife, keeper of secrets, turns the sheet in the light from a narrow window, searching the weave the way a scribe searches a page for a missing word. The bride speaks little. Speech is dangerous when the world waits for a single colour. In the courtyard, the groom's friends make practiced jokes that pass for courage. They boast because silence would expose fear, and fear would point to failure. A groom can be measured by the same cloth that measures his bride. If the fabric rises clean, the shame runs both ways. Not all men bleed honor from a woman. Some simply fail the test of action. So laughter fills the space where dread would otherwise show its face. A steward appears at the threshold, carrying a wooden frame with a strip of linen stretched taut. An everyday tool for drying, but today a ceremonial scaffold. The midwife steps forward with the bedsheet folded square, careful as a sacristan carrying a relic. She does not meet the bride's eyes. She has seen mornings that end in songs, and mornings that end in silence. In her apron pocket rests a vial wrapped in cloth, dark red when held to the light. It is not always used. It is always there. The logic of this morning seems simple to those who stand outside the chamber. Purity is white. Honor is red. The union of the two produces peace between families, certainty for contracts, safety for inheritances. Behind that, simplicity lies a lattice of law and fear. Dowry clauses hinge on consummation. Alliances need indisputable heirs. The parish priest blesses vows, but charters and chests require evidence. A sheet becomes testimony because bodies cannot be archived, and memory is not admissible when coin and land are at stake. The ritual never reads like law, although law crouches within it. In town ledgers and manorial rolls, clerks sometimes note marriage secured or union ratified, dry phrases that hide the spectacle. In houses of rank, a chamberlain might keep linens marked with family seals, stored after inspection as if parchment. In villages, the proof parades once, then dissolves into gossip that hardens into record. Either way, the stain travels farther than the couple's voices ever could. In noble halls, the pressure sharpens. A kingdom has no patience for rumor about succession. Witnesses assemble as if for a treaty, though the treaty was signed yesterday with rings and bread and wine. An uncle with the authority of age clears his throat. A lady cousin who knows too well the price of a spotless sheet turns aside. The chamber door opens. For a heartbeat, the room holds its air. Then cloth rises in practiced hands, and a sound moves through the watching crowd. Not loud, not soft, a single breath exhaled together. On good mornings, that breath becomes a prayer and then a cheer. On other mornings, it curdles into doubt. Biology does not argue its case in this court. Some women do not bleed at first union. Some bled long before through accidents, falls, the ordinary roughness of work, riding, climbing, childhood misadventure. Some hymens stretch rather than tear. But custom refuses nuance. It clings to an image because images are easy to carry into marketplaces and councils. The sheet decides because it is visible, portable, undeniable to those who prefer symbols to complexity. Women learn the hazards early from older women who survived them. Tricks circulate not as games, but as lifelines. A prick to the thigh, timed with the extinguishing of candles. a smear of pigeon blood on linen hidden under the mattress, a tincture that irritates tissue and produces a convincing trace, a whispered pact between midwife and bride that both will take to the grave. These are acts of defense in a world that mistakes theatre for truth. They are also risks. If a deception is discovered, shame doubles and danger follows. Accusation can leap from fraud to sorcery, from sorcery to heresy, from heresy to punishment no family can repay. The men who demand proof step into a net of expectations they did not weave, but are eager to police. A father believes he purchases certainty through a dowry. A groom believes he must exhibit mastery. A priest believes that order is preserved when private acts feed public peace. Each finds comfort in the stain because it tells a story that requires nothing of them but recognition. In this comfort lies the cruelty. A bride's pain becomes pageant, and her silence becomes part of the script. Sometimes there is no stain and no trick, only truth. On such mornings, negotiation begins in a second chamber, away from the courtyard. The priest advises patience. The steward proposes another night. The mothers press hands and weigh outcomes. To declare failure is to invite annulment proceedings, to unravel contracts already celebrated, to spill coin from coffer and favor from lord. Often, a compromise appears, stitched from convenience and fear. An oath sworn, a linen secretly marked by a sympathetic hand, a story agreed upon and told with steady eyes. The village accepts the story because the village needs the story. Order eats doubt for breakfast. In borderlands and market towns, the customs vary, though the purpose rarely changes. In some places, a modest unveiling replaces the parade of sheets, a dignified gesture that still serves the gaze. In others, a bedding ceremony turns the threshold into theatre. Neighbours escorting the couple to the room with jokes and songs that sound cheerful and feel sharp. Sometimes the ritual subsides into a private inspection by two matrons who swear to what they see and then release the house to celebration. No matter the form, the axis remains the same. The community insists on a sign that intimacy has been converted into legitimacy. What does the groom feel in this machinery? He may relish the congratulations, the manly claps on the shoulder, the ribald toasts that mask fragile pride. He may also dread the moment when the frame lifts and nothing appears. A man's honor can be wounded by the same linen that wounds a woman's life. Failure to consummate may be read as weakness, as impotence of body or will. To escape that verdict, some grooms push beyond tenderness, turning a night that could have begun with trust into a conquest stage for spectators. Violence hides inside the applause. Chronicles sometimes mention mournings that moved history. A royal marriage questioned by a spotless sheet, a council convened to protect a treaty, a queen compelled to submit to examinations that piled humiliation upon fear. Even where scribes omit descriptions, the consequences ripple outward. Embassies recalled, border garrisons doubled, cousins raised as rival claimants because someone's honor was doubted on a night when two people were supposed to learn each other's names without witnesses. Art carries the memory in subtle ways. Marginal drawings in manuscripts show beds like altars, sheets like banners, brides like captives crowned with flowers. Moral plays stage chaste heroines who bleed bright proof as if virtue were a vein. Ballads praise husbands who guard their wives' honor, not with tenderness, but with scrutiny. The image turns so often, it looks natural. Viewers forget that it was carved to fit a law that could not bear the weight of complexity. The church speaks with two voices that rarely acknowledge each other. One voice praises the sacrament of marriage as a private bond protected by conscience, a union sealed by consent. The other voice tolerates the public hunger for certainty and does not fight the parade that follows the blessing. Confessors hear the sorrow of brides who dread the morning, and some advise gentleness, patience, time. Parish life, however, flows around such counsel like water around a stone. Custom, once rooted, grows stronger than sermons. The midwife knows this better than any priest. She has watched the wheel turn through decades, watched girls become wives, Wives become mothers. Mothers become the older women who whisper the same instructions they received. She carries herbs that soothe and vials that save, and she keeps the stories that no one writes down. In her memory lives a ledger of mornings, a cheerful crowd, a quiet father, a spiteful aunt, a groom who apologized in whispers no one else would hear. She knows that the sheet proves nothing about kindness, nothing about fidelity, nothing about the season of years to come. On some mornings, there is blood, and it causes no peace. A bruise blooms where no one will see. A laugh in the courtyard becomes a wince in the chamber. The stain purchases silence for the bruiser, who will be praised as a man who fulfilled his role. In this way, the ritual rewards the wrong lesson and trains the village to applaud its own blindness. Some wives learn to protect themselves with alliances of women, with cousins and godmothers, who stand near at feasts and linger near at markets. Sisterhood grows in the shadow of the sheet, stubborn as ivy under stone. On other mornings, the sheet is clean and the world does not end. A groom defies the script and shrugs before his friends. A father chooses his daughter over the gossip he once believed. A priest uses the authority of his office to declare consummation where he cannot know. These mercies are rare, but they exist, and they travel like warm rumors that steady hearts. Quiet rebellions seldom make records, though they rescue lives one household at a time. Trade routes carry spices and silk and also customs, so the ritual travels with merchants and minstrels. In port cities, a traveller can hear 10 versions in 1 week. A noble house that stitched crimson thread into sheets to spare fright. A mountain village that dyes ritual linens with madder, so worry dissolves into dye. A market town that places a rosemary sprig on the window after the bedding as a sign that no one will ask questions. The same need, the same fear, adapts itself to local taste, the way a song collects new verses mile by mile. Why does the crowd cling so fiercely to this proof? Because uncertainty terrifies communities that depend on order to survive lean winters and hard taxes. Because property must move from father to child without dispute. Because men fear being mocked, and women fear being unprotected, and both fears seek shields that do not require thought. A sheet seems solid. It can be held, waved, stored. It promises that the invisible work of intimacy has produced a visible token. It is a false promise, but it is convenient, and convenience often wins. The bride in the chamber finally stands. The midwife has folded the linen in a practice square. Outside, someone begins a tune that can turn into a celebration song, or a dirge of mockery with only a shift in tempo. The groom waits with his smile prepared in 2 versions. Parents gather themselves into dignity. The door opens. A rectangle of daylight lands across the floor. On this morning, the cloth bears a small, clear mark. It does not measure tenderness. It does not forecast harmony. It does not protect the bride from the 1,000 trials that follow this day. It simply buys peace for the next hour, the next feast, the next set of signatures. The crowd, hungry for certainty, accepts the purchase. Trenches will be filled, cups passed, musicians paid. Children will sleep while the last guests wander home. The village will tell itself that honor has been weighed and found complete. Under the bed, where rushes soften the chill, a fallen hairpin glints. On the hearth, a twig of lavender blackens and crumbles. In a corner, the midwife's apron hangs, heavier by one empty vial that will be washed at the well before anyone notices. The bride exhales, not from triumph, not from comfort, but from relief that feels like the loosening of a knot. She has survived the first lesson of a lifetime inside a system that asks for blood when it should ask for kindness. The ritual will return tomorrow for someone else, and the day after, and the season after. It will travel in wagons with dowry chests, in saddlebags with family seals, in songs that drunk men shout at the moon. It will endure because it serves too many hungers at once. It will endure until another idea of honor grows large enough to eclipse it. That idea will not fit on linen. It will be measured in quiet patience, in promises kept when no one watches, in the way a couple learns to turn toward or away from one another when storms come. For now the village watches the red sign rise above the crowd and hears the cheer it demanded. The bride steps into the noise with her new name fastened like a clasp at her throat. She knows that the morning belongs to the sheet and the night belonged to everyone but her. She also knows that the years ahead, if she can claim them, might one day belong to her own judgment rather than theirs. The proof they wanted has been given. The truth she needs will take longer. Picture a medieval town settling into darkness. Shop shutters pull closed. A watchman walks the wall and taps his staff against stone. Inside, candles thin the gloom and prayers whisper through rafters. In this world, love and the body are not private possessions. They belong, so people believe, to heaven's design, to parish custom, to guild honor, to a fragile network of promises that binds field to manor, family to lineage, and soul to salvation. Within that tight weave, same-sex desire is not only a personal secret, it is a disturbance in the fabric of order. That is why many preachers call it a sin that tears at the world, a stain that alarms confession manuals, city statutes, and royal jurists. To understand the fear, we have to enter the medieval imagination on its own terms, quietly, without mockery, like guests stepping over a threshold. The first strand of that imagination is theological. Medieval thought treats the cosmos as a ladder of purposes. Stones exist to support, plants to nourish, animals to move and sense, humans to reason and love, angels to contemplate. Every rung has a goal, and every goal is linked to a creator whose will gives meaning to motion. Sexual acts sit inside that teleology. They are not only personal pleasures, they are tools for generation, entrusted to marriage so that families can endure, parishes can grow, and the rhythm of work and worship can continue. In this reasoning, acts that cannot open to generation are classified as against nature, not because nature is a moral judge, but because it is a script. Break the script, and you break the harmony that lifts creation toward its end. When a confessor copies a list of vices, or when a university master glosses a sentence of Augustine, that ladder is in his mind. He is not weighing romance. He is guarding a staircase. The second strand is legal, and it spreads through both church courts and civic councils. Sodomy, the umbrella term in many records, does not map neatly onto modern categories. It can include a spectrum of acts, sometimes even non-sexual offences folded in through metaphor. The point is less taxonomy than boundary keeping. City statutes from Italian communes, Iberian kingdoms, and certain French towns announce penalties that climb from fines to exile and, in times and places of severe crackdown, to execution. Elsewhere, punishments are rarer or folded into quiet penance. Variations are wide, but the message is consistent. Authorities claim the right to define acceptable use of the body because the body is a public instrument. It bears coats of arms, inheritance, military service, and sacramental dignity. When law steps in, it is defending those outward claims at least as much as inward morals. The third strand is social dread about lineage. Medieval society rests on households that transfer property and protection down the generations. Land charters and marriage contracts are not side papers. They are the spine of stability. Anxieties about non-procreative sex therefore mix with anxieties about broken lines, contested dowers, and vanishing heirs. A family without a son to inherit a fief, or without a daughter to seal an alliance, can fall from its place among neighbours almost overnight. Sermons turn that anxiety into parable. If seed misses its field, harvest fails. If branches bear no fruit, winter conquers the orchard. The metaphors are agricultural because the fear is agricultural. No offspring, no continuity, no safety. The fourth strand is medical theory, where humours rule. Learned physicians and popular healers alike imagine the body as a vat of hot and cold, wet and dry, constantly seeking balance. Desire flows through that vat. Excess heat sparks restless appetite. Excess cold withers it. Disordered mixtures incline a person toward practices physicians label unbalanced. None of this physiology is modern, but it supplies a vocabulary that preachers can borrow. Certain habits are not simply wicked, they are diseased, contagious, a fever of the city. When a confessor prescribes long fasts or pilgrimages for unnatural vice, he often imagines a cure for an overheated will. Again, he is tending the staircase of purposes with the tools he knows. There is also the architecture of confession. Handbooks used by parish priests, especially from the High Middle Ages onward, classify sexual acts with fine detail and assign penances of frightening length. The lists can shock modern readers by their precision. Their goal, however, is procedural. Priests must ask the right questions so that no sin slips past unshriven. For an unconfessed sin endangers not only one's soul, but the sacramental integrity of the parish. A vice that appears to cut across divine purpose receives the strictest framing. That is why glossators elevate the language and treat same-sex acts as if they aim not only at pleasure, but at rebellion against the order of creation. Words harden because the sacrament, in their view, depends on contours that must not blur. Fear intensifies in cities where surveillance grows. Florence, for a period, staffs an office of the night to investigate accusations. Other communes appoint special magistrates. The rhetoric around those institutions is civic. They protect youth, honor, and the image of the city. Behind the rhetoric sits a practical engine. Fines feed treasuries. Prosecutions advertise virtue to rival towns. Factional politics sometimes use moral charges to wound enemies. Records thus mix genuine moral panic with opportunism. That blend strengthens the impression that same-sex desire is a public danger. If councils debate it and treasuries count it, it must be a force that the city must master. None of this means medieval Europe is one voice. There are cloisters that speak tenderly about spiritual friendship, and letters between monks or nuns that celebrate affection with heat of language learned from the Psalms. There are courts that look away from rumor rather than ignite scandal. There are regions where prosecutions are sparse, where neighbors prefer silence and private correction. A continent is not a single pulpit. Still, across languages and laws, the same scaffolding appears: purpose, lineage, sacrament, and order. It is the scaffolding that lifts sin into threat, and threat into the phrase, without pardon. A phrase that sounds absolute in the street, even when scholars know that theology reserves the strict label, unforgivable, for a much narrower fault. Street language outruns doctrine because fear travels faster than commentary. Punishment, where it falls, varies by status. A laborer might face the lash, a trader a ruinous fine, a servant dismissal and homelessness. A cleric risks deposition and secular handover. A noble can trade coin for discretion unless factional enemies see advantage. Women complicate the record, not because love between women is unknown, but because legal texts written by men often overlook it or fold it under ambiguous categories. When female cases appear, they reveal similar patterns of anxiety. Tools that mimic male bodies are banned. Masculine dress signals transgression. Midwives are drawn in as witnesses. Silence in the archive is not safety. It is a shadow that hides many lives. The pulpit sharpens edges. Preachers assemble biblical stories, Sodom, Romans 1, moralized bestiaries, and weld them into one alarm. Their goal is theatrical. An image that stings is easier to remember than a sober gloss. So they paint the vice as a fire that jumps from house to house. They warn that armies fall when cities condone it, that earthquakes strike where it is tolerated, that plague follows pride. Catastrophe turns desire into omen. In that charged atmosphere, an accusation can become a moral weapon. Enemies call each other sodomite, and the word sticks even when evidence fails, because the fear it names is cosmic, not forensic. And still, under this canopy of dread, people love, as people always have. In guild halls and kitchens, in cloisters and barracks, friendship deepens into something the law cannot easily name. Letters hide it in metaphors. Poems dress it in courtly allegory. Confession manuals try to pin it, and sometimes fail, because desire outruns categories. A tailor learns to lower his eyes in the market. A page learns to speak safely in the stables. A nun learns which lines of the Song of Songs she can copy into a private breviary without drawing censure. Life persists in the gaps between sermon and statute. When authorities claim that same-sex love threatens the common good, they also mean that it threatens a story. The story says, God set means toward ends, marriage channels desire toward blessing, households anchor the future, sacraments sanctify the turning of seasons, cities prosper when each role holds. Same-sex desire, by refusing the assigned channel, presses the story to bend. To those invested in the tale, the bending looks like a crack. That is why language hardens into superlative dread. It is easier to call a thing unforgivable than to admit that the tale might stretch. Humiliation is part of the mechanism. Punishments, where recorded, often include processions, shaved heads, special garments, or forced parades past church doors. The point is pedagogy. Shame teaches the neighborhood where the fence stands. A vice singled out as against nature receives a public theater that signals, again and again, that the body is a civic sign and the city will write upon it. The theater frightens some into silence and pushes others deeper into secrecy, which in turn convinces magistrates that conspiracies lurk in shadows. Secrecy becomes proof, and proof justifies new surveillance. If we listen longer, we hear counter-melodies. Mystical writers speak of a love that dissolves binaries, a union of souls beyond male and female in the embrace of God. Legal humanists, much later, doubt the use of burning for private acts and argue for proportional remedies. Popular tales mock hypocrites who thunder against sin while sneaking through side doors. Nothing in the Middle Ages is entirely one tone. But the dominant register remains: purpose, lineage, sacrament, order. That register sets the pitch for the label unforgivable, a label more social than dogmatic, more theatrical than precise, and very hard to escape once applied. Stand again at the edge of that medieval town as night deepens. The watchman has passed. Candles gutter. Inside many houses, love is a comfort and a danger, a sweetness that must be spoken in careful grammar. The parish bell that rings at dawn will call souls to a system that believes it knows where every gesture belongs. To live outside that map is to feel the wind of many powers: pulpit, law, household, rumor. The fear that called same-sex love, an unpardonable wound, grew from a wish to keep the map intact, to hold the harvest steady, to guard the staircase. Knowing that does not excuse the harm, but it explains the logic. And in that explanation lies a quieter truth. The label was never about a single heart. It was about a world anxious to keep its pattern from slipping in the dark. Under the dim flicker of torchlight, imagine yourself walking into a medieval courtroom. The benches creak, the scent of wax and damp stone hangs heavy. A clerk is unrolling parchment, a scribe sharpens his quill, and a bailiff clears his throat. At the center of this grim stage stands a queen, or a duchess, or perhaps a noblewoman of high birth. Her face is veiled, but whispers dart like arrows through the chamber. She is accused of adultery. In the medieval world, this is not a private matter, not merely a family quarrel. It is a public crime, a political weapon, a charge that can end a dynasty and send a crown rolling into the dust. Tonight, we are going to step inside the perilous world of royal marriages, where love is a luxury, loyalty is demanded, and suspicion of infidelity can ignite revolutions. The medieval queen carried more than jewels and silks on her shoulders. She bore the weight of alliances forged across borders, the duty to produce heirs, and the expectation of spotless virtue. A king's legitimacy often rested upon the perceived purity of his consort. If she gave birth to a son, that child had to be unquestionably his. If rumors of adultery arose, even without proof, the entire line of succession could be thrown into chaos. Rival factions seized on such whispers eagerly, because to question a queen's fidelity was to question the bloodline itself, and in a time when dynasties were fragile, that was enough to topple thrones. History offers many harrowing examples. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. Twice a queen, mother of kings, she was accused of misconduct more than once. Whispers of affairs with noblemen, even with her own uncle. Whether true or not, these rumors were politically convenient weapons used to isolate her, especially when her marriage to Louis VII of France faltered. Later, as the wife of Henry II of England, her sons would rise in rebellion, and her supposed infidelities became fodder for chroniclers eager to paint her as dangerous and untrustworthy. No execution followed, but her long imprisonment speaks to the peril of being suspected. Contrast Eleanor's fate with that of Anne Boleyn, centuries later, but still within the medieval mindset of kingship and queenship. Married to Henry VIII, she was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. Whether the charges were fabricated is almost beyond doubt. They were political instruments, used to rid the king of a wife who had failed to produce a male heir and to clear the path for another marriage. Anne's supposed betrayal was not treated as a personal failing. It was framed as treason, because by violating her vows, she was said to endanger the very future of the crown. The sentence was death by sword, carried out swiftly, a public reminder that queens who lost the game of loyalty could lose everything. Why were these accusations so effective? Because they fused morality with politics, sexuality with sovereignty. Adultery was not only a breach of trust between husband and wife, it was a rupture in the sacred fabric that bound people to their ruler. A queen was often likened to the Virgin Mary in symbolic imagery, the spotless mother of heirs who would ensure divine order continued. If she strayed, she was cast as Eve, temptress, corrupter, the one who brings ruin. This duality left women little room to breathe. One rumor could push them from saint to sinner, from crowned majesty to condemned criminal. But accusations of adultery were rarely about love. They were about power. Factions within a court, ambitious nobles, or even kings themselves wielded the charge like a dagger. If a queen stood in the way, perhaps because her family alliance no longer served its purpose, or because she produced daughters instead of sons, or simply because the king desired another woman, then whispers of infidelity could be summoned from the shadows. Once spoken aloud, they clung like poison. Trials were often spectacles, heavy with testimony from servants, intercepted letters, or confessions wrung under duress. The outcome was almost predetermined, for the accusation itself created a stain that no truth could wash away. Consider Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Her marriage was notorious for the king's preference for male favourites, which left her humiliated and politically sidelined. In time, she allied with Roger Mortimer, and together they deposed her husband. Chroniclers eager to condemn her power painted Isabella as the adulterous she-wolf of France, even though her actions were more political revolution than bedroom scandal. Still, the accusation of sexual treachery clung to her name for centuries, proving that when a woman wielded authority beyond expectation, sexuality became the easiest weapon to strike her down. This pattern reveals something deeper about the medieval world. Sexuality was inseparable from governance. A king's authority rested on divine right, but also on bloodlines. A queen's fidelity, therefore, was not her own private virtue. It was the kingdom's foundation stone. To question it was to question the crown itself. And unlike men, whose infidelities were often tolerated or ignored, women faced an asymmetry of judgment. A king's mistress might be an open secret, even a source of patronage and influence, but a queen's suspected lover was treated as a usurper of the throne's legitimacy, a thief of dynastic honor. Beyond courts and chronicles, the spectacle of accusing queens served a broader purpose. It reminded all women of their place. Tales of adulterous queens circulated in ballads, morality plays, and sermons, reinforcing the message that a woman's worth lay in her chastity and obedience. Even fictional heroines, like Guinevere in Arthurian legend, became cautionary figures, blamed for the downfall of kingdoms through their affairs. Myth and history blended, ensuring that no woman of rank could forget that her body was bound to the fate of nations. Punishments varied. Some queens, like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, lost their heads. Others were imprisoned for years, stripped of influence, or exiled to convents where they faded from memory. A few, like Eleanor, managed to survive and even regain power, but only after enduring long humiliations. Always, the charge left scars, reshaping reputations for centuries. A condemned man might be remembered as a tyrant or a fool. A condemned woman was almost always remembered first as unfaithful. beneath the shadow of these accusations, human truths linger. Not every marriage was cold calculation. Not every rumor was false. Some queens did seek companionship beyond their husbands, whether for love, for comfort, or for rebellion against lives of isolation. Their stories are harder to recover, filtered through hostile records and biased chroniclers. But they remind us that queens, despite the crowns and titles, were still women, capable of desire, loneliness, and courage. Their private lives, however, were never private. The walls of the court had ears, and every sigh could echo into history. So when we look back on the medieval stage, where queens were paraded as symbols of purity and condemned as traitors when they faltered, we glimpse the dangerous intersection of love and power. The accusation of adultery was never only about two people. It was about nations, dynasties, and divine order. To be a queen was to live under a sword that could fall at any whisper, and to be accused was often to be doomed, whether or not the charge was true. Under the vaulted ceilings of a medieval city, candlelight flickers in narrow alleyways where laughter, whispers, and footsteps mingle with the scent of smoke and sweat. Behind wooden doors, within houses marked by discreet lanterns, lies one of the most paradoxical institutions of the Middle Ages: the brothel. Unlike the secretive, hidden establishments of later centuries, prostitution in medieval Europe was not entirely condemned nor entirely celebrated. It existed in a grey space between sin and necessity, between law and vice, woven into the very structure of urban life. Tonight, we step into this world, exploring why sex work was tolerated, even legalized, in an era dominated by faith and morality. At first glance, it may seem shocking that the same society which demanded chastity from queens, punished women for adultery, and condemned lust from the pulpit also permitted brothels to flourish. But this was a society of contradictions. Church leaders declared lust a deadly sin, yet they recognized that men, especially unmarried men, would seek release. To ignore this was to invite chaos, rape, adultery, or worse, in the eyes of medieval lawmakers. So, paradoxically, many cities sanctioned prostitution as a lesser evil. By confining vice to certain streets, rulers believed they protected honorable women and maintained public order. Consider Paris in the 13th century. The city government designated special zones for prostitution, where women could legally offer their services under municipal oversight. Tax records reveal that prostitutes paid fees to the city, a revenue stream that authorities did not ignore. In London, Southwark became infamous for its licensed stews, public bathhouses that doubled as brothels. Across German towns, regulations dictated how women dressed, where they lived, and how much they could charge. Far from being an underground activity, prostitution was embedded in civic economies, a strange alliance between sin and state. But legalization did not mean respect. Prostitutes were often required to wear distinctive clothing, bright stripes, bells, or colored veils that marked them as women of vice. This made them visible and vulnerable, branded in a society obsessed with reputation. They were barred from certain festivals, forbidden from marrying respectable men, and excluded from church sacraments unless they renounced their trade. In essence, the law protected their work while society condemned their souls. Yet, the reality of these women's lives was complex. Some entered the trade by choice, seeking independence and income in a world that left few options for women outside marriage or convents. Others were forced by poverty, abandonment, or coercion. Brothel keepers, often women themselves, managed houses that became paradoxical spaces of female autonomy and exploitation. Inside, prostitutes could earn coin, manage clients, and carve a fragile survival. Outside, they risked abuse, disease, and scorn. The church's stance was equally contradictory. Officially, prostitution was labeled sinful. The fall of Eve multiplied across generations. Preachers thundered against fallen women, and confessors demanded renunciation. But theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that prostitution, while immoral, served a social function. Better, they said, to contain lust within brothels than allow it to corrupt wives and virgins. This pragmatic tolerance created a strange coexistence. Priests railing in sermons, bishops quietly taxing the very trade they condemned. Public authorities, too, saw benefits. In some towns, brothels were owned by the municipality itself, their profits feeding into public coffers. City councils justified this by citing order and morality. By offering men an outlet, they claimed, prostitution prevented greater evils. This reasoning reveals much about medieval gender norms. Women were expected to preserve chastity, while men's desires were considered uncontrollable forces that required institutional management. Life inside a brothel was not merely transactional. These establishments became social hubs, places where men drank, gambled, and mingled. Records from Augsburg and Nuremberg show that prostitutes were hired for feasts, parades, and even civic celebrations. Some brothels operated almost like guilds, with rules of conduct, curfews, and fines for unruly clients. Yet disease lurked constantly. The spread of venereal illnesses, though poorly understood, often sparked moral panics, leading to temporary crackdowns. Still, the cycle repeated. Prohibition led to underground chaos, and legalization returned as the safer solution. Stories from medieval chronicles illuminate the contradictions. In Florence, prostitutes were sometimes invited to perform symbolic acts during festivals, embodying vice that the city ritually cast out. In Avignon, the papal court itself was accused of harboring brothels near its gates, hypocrisy that critics gleefully recorded. And in Venice, a city famed for both commerce and sin, prostitutes became part of the urban spectacle, their presence tolerated as long as they remained within prescribed boundaries. But beneath these policies lay human lives. The young woman who entered a brothel after her husband died in battle, the girl sold by her family to pay debts, the experienced madam who negotiated fiercely with officials while protecting her workers as best she could. Each story reveals resilience and tragedy interwoven, survival at the cost of reputation, agency tempered by exploitation. The tolerance of prostitution also reveals how medieval societies constructed morality. Sin was never eradicated, it was managed. Authorities sought not to eliminate lust, but to control its expression, to funnel desire into sanctioned spaces where it could be taxed, contained, and surveilled. This logic laid the foundation for centuries of ambiguous policies towards sex work, oscillating between repression and regulation. In the end, the medieval brothel was not simply a house of vice, it was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of its world, a society that preached chastity yet profited from lust, that condemned women yet relied on their labor, that feared sin yet institutionalized it. To walk those narrow streets was to step into a world where morality bent under the weight of pragmatism, and where every candle-lit window told a story of survival in the shadows of faith and law. Beneath the vaulted chambers of castles and the whispered halls of medieval courts, there existed an unspoken truth. Kings, lords, and princes often kept secret harems of concubines, mistresses, and companions. In an age where marriage was rarely about love, but rather about politics, land, and alliances, rulers sought passion elsewhere. Tonight, we peel back the curtain on this hidden world, where desire collided with power, and secrecy cloaked what the church condemned but kings indulged. Medieval marriage, especially among nobility, was a tool of diplomacy. Queens were chosen not for romance, but for bloodlines, dowries, and alliances. A king might wed a princess from a distant land to secure peace, but affection was seldom guaranteed. Into this void stepped mistresses, women who offered comfort, intimacy, and influence away from the rigid confines of arranged unions. These women lived in the shadows, yet their impact often rippled across kingdoms. Take, for example, the court of France. Monarchs such as Charles VII openly favoured mistresses who wielded immense power. Agnes Sorel, his beloved companion, became known as the first official royal mistress of Europe. Though scandalous, her beauty and charm earned her influence in political decisions, fashion, and even the king's foreign policies. She was showered with jewels, estates, and titles, embodying the paradox of women celebrated in private, yet condemned by clerics. England, too, bore its share of royal secrets. Medieval kings like Henry II kept Eleanor of Aquitaine as queen, yet his heart wandered to Rosamund Clifford, the famous Fair Rosamund. Their romance became the stuff of legend, whispered in cloisters and taverns alike. Chroniclers tell of hidden gardens, secret staircases, and clandestine meetings, all designed to shield passion from public scrutiny. The church thundered against such liaisons, yet kings defied it, certain that power excused indulgence. These arrangements extended beyond royalty. Nobles across Europe maintained concubines, sometimes openly within their castles. Unlike queens, who were bound by strict moral codes, concubines often enjoyed freedoms of influence. They became confidants, advisors, and sometimes the true power behind the throne. Some bore illegitimate children who later shaped dynasties. The medieval world knew them as bastards, yet many rose to knighthood, bishoprics, or even claims to crowns. William the Conqueror himself was born illegitimate, proving that love outside marriage could leave legacies carved into history. Yet secrecy remained essential. The church condemned fornication, branding mistresses as agents of sin. Preachers warned kings that concubinage would bring divine wrath upon their realms. Still, behind palace walls, the rules bent. Chaplains might turn a blind eye, courtiers kept silent, and servants carried the burden of discretion. Gossip, however, could not be silenced forever. Rumors of a king's mistress often stirred court rivalries, breeding envy and political intrigue. Queens, though often humiliated, had little recourse. To object too strongly risked destabilizing alliances or drawing the king's wrath. For the women themselves, life in these secret harems was precarious. Some rose to extraordinary wealth, commanding influence over courts, shaping fashion, even deciding appointments of ministers or generals. Others fell swiftly, discarded when beauty faded or political winds shifted. A mistress could live like a queen one day and be cast into obscurity the next. Theirs was a life of both privilege and peril. It is important to see these harems not only as indulgence, but as symbols of power. A king's ability to surround himself with women demonstrated dominance, wealth, and virility in a culture where masculinity was bound to conquest. Just as great halls displayed trophies of war, so too did the presence of mistresses display the ruler's command over desire. It was theatre, whispered and unseen, yet deeply symbolic to those within courtly circles. Interestingly, records reveal that not all mistresses were hidden. In certain courts, they were paraded as symbols of beauty, patrons of art, or muses of poets. Troubadours sang of them, chroniclers hinted at them, and sometimes even rival nations knew their names. The contradiction of their existence, condemned yet admired, speaks to the complexity of medieval morality. Society needed them to exist in silence, yet it could not resist talking about them. The stories of these women echo through history not only as scandal, but as survival. In a world where women's fates were often controlled by men, mistresses carved paths of influence using charm, wit, and resilience. They lived on the margins of respectability, yet they shaped politics, art, and dynasties. Their shadows stretch across centuries, reminding us that behind every throne lay secrets untold, passions hidden, and women who wielded quiet but formidable power. The medieval harem was not the opulent palace of Eastern imagination, but it was no less significant. It was built from secrecy, whispers, and candlelight, sustained by desire and politics, condemned from pulpits yet tolerated in practice. To understand it is to understand the tension at the heart of medieval life, a world torn between sin and survival, passion and order, faith and flesh. Under the torchlight of medieval wedding feasts, amid the laughter of guests and the clinking of goblets, an unsettling truth lingered in the air. Marriage was not merely a union of two souls, but a performance of fertility, honor, and power. And in many regions of medieval Europe, rituals carried echoes of public intimacy, ceremonies where privacy ended, and the most sacred act of marriage became a communal spectacle. Tonight, we explore the disturbing tradition of public sexual rituals woven into medieval weddings, a practice both shocking and symbolic, where the line between sacred vow and social theatre blurred. Marriage in the medieval world was rarely about romance. It was about alliances, property, and legitimacy. Bloodlines had to be proven, heirs had to be assured, and the act of consummation, the physical union, was not merely personal, but political. To fail at consummation was to risk annulment, scandal, or even war between families. That is why, in certain courts and villages, consummation itself became a matter of public concern. One of the most unsettling practices was the witnessed bedding. After the vows and feasting, the couple was escorted to the bridal chamber not in quiet dignity, but in loud procession. Guests, sometimes family, nobles, even clergy, accompanied the bride and groom, offering bawdy songs, jokes, and advice. The newlyweds were expected to climb into bed while attendants stood by, ensuring that the union was not only celebrated but literally supervised. In some cases, the priest blessed the bed, sprinkling holy water upon the sheets as if sanctifying the act about to occur. The message was clear. This was not just about love. It was about duty to family, society, and God. In parts of France and Germany, Witnesses sometimes stayed long enough to see the couple lying together, half naked beneath the sheets, as proof that consummation would occur. In rare accounts, the act itself was not fully private, with servants or chosen witnesses present to verify penetration, and thus confirm that the marriage was legitimate. Such details, shocking to modern sensibilities, were written into chronicles as legal safeguards. A noblewoman's virginity was not her private matter. It was the honor of her entire family, and the blood on the wedding sheet became evidence of that honor. Why such invasive rituals? In a society where inheritance and property hinged on bloodlines, proof of consummation mattered more than the comfort of the couple. A union unconsummated could be annulled by the church, freeing a husband or wife to remarry. For kings and nobles, this meant broken alliances and unstable dynasties. The bedding ceremony and the public rituals around it were designed to remove all doubt, to declare before the community that heirs could and would be produced. But beyond the noble courts, village traditions carried their own form of sexual theatre. In some rural customs, the bride and groom were escorted to bed amid lewd songs and symbolic gestures. Guests might throw grain or nuts onto the bed, symbols of fertility. In certain traditions, the bride's stockings were cut or her garters removed before cheering crowds, a symbolic undressing that blurred into voyeurism. These rituals, though couched in humor and fertility symbolism, placed extraordinary pressure on the couple, turning intimacy into public duty. Queens and princesses endured this spectacle with even less privacy. Chroniclers record how Catherine of Aragon's first marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, was carefully observed. Servants stood outside chambers, and the next morning, sheets were displayed as proof of consummation. In France, similar practices followed royal brides, where the entire court expected evidence by dawn. In these cases, the bedding ritual was not simply symbolic. It was binding testimony that could determine a woman's reputation, her children's legitimacy, and even international treaties. For the bride, this ritual was fraught with fear. She entered not only a marriage but a public trial of her body. Any failure to bleed, any hesitation by the groom, could cast suspicion and scandal. For the groom, it was equally daunting. Consummation was tied to his honor, his masculinity, and his political responsibility. Chroniclers mention young grooms mocked for their inability to perform under pressure, sometimes leading to annulments and disgrace. The church itself sent mixed messages. On one hand, priests condemned lust outside wedlock. On the other, they sanctified marital sex as duty, often intruding upon it with prayers and blessings. This strange duality, sinful yet sacred, reinforced the idea that consummation was less about love than about obedience to divine and social order. Though not every wedding involved such explicit rituals, the symbolism of public sexuality permeated medieval marriage culture. The idea that fertility, lineage, and legitimacy were communal concerns meant that no act of intimacy was entirely private. For the powerful, it was a performance of dynastic stability. For commoners, it was a community's reassurance that two families had truly become one. And for the couple, it was often a terrifying initiation into a life where the most private act was never fully their own. To look back upon these customs is to glimpse a world where marriage was less about love and more about spectacle, where intimacy was invaded by politics, religion, and community expectation. It reminds us how differently people of the past viewed privacy, honor, and sexuality. For them, the bedchamber was not a sanctuary, but a stage, and the audience waited eagerly for the curtain to rise. In the heart of medieval society, women were bound not only by vows of loyalty to their husbands, but also by rigid codes of sexual morality. The community, the church, and even the law demanded that their bodies remain pure until marriage and faithful afterward. The measure of this purity often came down to one grim practice: the ritual display of blood as a public symbol of honor. To modern eyes, it is a disturbing tradition. Marriage sheets stained with blood paraded as evidence that a bride had been untouched before her wedding night. Yet in medieval Europe, this was not simply superstition, but a form of proof with the weight of law, family honor, and divine judgment behind it. The morning after a wedding night, expectations were rarely of privacy or gentle beginnings. Instead, many brides awoke under the eyes of servants and family members who demanded evidence of consummation. Sheets were carefully inspected for spots of blood, believed to be the result of the bride's hymen breaking during intercourse. If blood was present, it was celebrated as confirmation of her virginity. If not, suspicions could spread like wildfire. Rumors of impurity could destroy reputations, annul marriages, or even lead to punishment. Why was this ritual taken so seriously? The answer lies in the medieval obsession with inheritance and lineage. A woman's virginity was not her own, but the property of her family, a guarantee that any children she bore would be legitimate heirs to property, land, or titles. Without proof, alliances between families might crumble. Fathers and brothers placed extraordinary pressure on daughters and sisters, for their blood was tied directly to the honor of the entire lineage. In certain regions of France and Italy, chroniclers describe actual public ceremonies where sheets were displayed the morning after the wedding feast. In noble courts, these sheets might even be presented before an audience of relatives and servants, sometimes hung outside windows or in courtyards for all to see. This grotesque theatre transformed private intimacy into communal spectacle, reducing a woman's body to a symbol, her pain to entertainment, and her blood to legal evidence. The church both supported and complicated these customs. Virginity was celebrated as holy, and consummation marked the spiritual completion of a marriage. At the same time, church law demanded consummation for a union to be valid. Thus, the stained sheet became both religious proof and civil safeguard. Some priests even blessed the sheets, offering prayers that the marriage be fruitful and faithful, entwining faith and flesh in a disturbing ritual. But what of the women themselves? Imagine the anxiety of a bride forced into this spectacle. Not all women bled on their wedding night. Medical science now shows that hymens vary widely, and some tear long before marriage, while others stretch without breaking. Yet in the medieval world, failure to bleed was seen as failure of virtue. Many young women turned to desperate measures. Records describe brides pricking themselves with sharp objects, or smearing drops of animal blood onto sheets to avoid shame. Families sometimes colluded in these deceptions, knowing that honor was at stake. The cruelty of this ritual extended further. In certain villages, older women were assigned to inspect the bride physically before marriage, searching for signs of chastity. Others forced brides to confess their sexual history in humiliating detail. These practices left scars not only on individuals but on generations, teaching women that their value lay not in their character or abilities, but in the presence or absence of blood on a sheet. Among royalty, the stakes were higher still. Queens were expected to prove their purity, not only to their husbands, but to entire kingdoms. Chroniclers recorded whether blood was present on royal wedding sheets, and absence of it fueled scandals that echoed across courts. Some queens, accused of failing to produce proof, faced annulment, exile, or worse. In one infamous case, whispers about a queen's wedding sheets nearly plunged 2 kingdoms into political crisis. The ritual of blood was, at its heart, a weapon of control. It stripped women of privacy, dignity, and autonomy, reducing their first night of marriage to a test staged for others. And while it may seem alien today, it reveals a chilling truth about the medieval mind. That sexuality was never private, but a matter of honor and survival, watched, judged, and recorded by an entire community. As we turn this dark page of history, we are left with questions. How many women lived in fear of that morning inspection? How many lives were shattered by the absence of a single stain? And how did entire societies come to accept such rituals as normal, binding, and even sacred? Perhaps the most haunting truth is that for centuries, women were forced to bleed not just for themselves, but for the pride and survival of everyone around them. Night drapes the scriptorium like a heavy velvet curtain. Wax settles in pale pools at the feet of a brass candlestick. Parchment breathes its faint animal scent. Quills whisper along the lines. A monk bends closer to a sheet ruled with red lead, his eyes steady, his wrist trained by decades of prayer and patience. He is illuminating a sacred text, and in the gilded initial, he paints a garden, a serpent, 2 figures who know neither seam nor stitch. Along the border, a siren lifts her mirror, a centaur draws a bow, and a sly fox preaches to a trusting flock. To a modern reader, the page feels perilous, holy words wrapped in bodies and glances. But to him, it is simply accurate. Scripture speaks to the whole person. The whole person must appear. To understand why sacred books carry sensitive scenes, you must step into a culture that reads with more than the eyes. Medieval readers expected images to teach, warn, and pierce the conscience. A naked body was not automatically an invitation to lust. It could be a mirror for vulnerability, mortality, and the wound of sin. When Adam and Eve appear without garments, the painter is not mocking modesty. He is staging the instant before shame is born, the fragile moment when innocence breathes and knowledge approaches like weather from the edge of the garden. Their bodies are not the punchline. They are the argument that creation was once unclothed and unafraid. In moralized Bibles, psalters, and books of hours, artists weave scenes of desire, betrayal, and judgment into a liturgy of warning. David watches Bathsheba by the water, so the gravity of the king's fall can be seen, not merely heard. Susanna stands in a garden while elders loom, so that false accusation, fear, and vindication gain faces the reader cannot forget. At the last judgment, angels and demons handle bodies, because no fabric can deceive the judge who reads marrow and motive. Painters do not add clothes where the narrative does not. Instead, they wrap scenes in symbols, fig leaves, towers, enclosed gardens, scales, lilies, so that meaning governs gaze. Often the startle lies not in the center, but at the edge. Margins sprout mischief, a fox preaching to geese, a monkey in a vest stealing a chalice, hybrid creatures dancing with bright, unthreatening eyes. To modern readers, such pains can look bawdy or frivolous. To their first audience, they were alarms with bells. Vice masquerades as entertainment. Distraction ambushes devotion. The ridiculous exposes the dangerous. By painting lust as a creature with a polished smile, the artist reminds the viewer that temptation rarely enters with fangs bared. It arrives rehearsed and charming. Laughter, sharpened by parable, becomes offense. Then there is the Song of Songs, the most fragrant paradox in the canon. The poem speaks in vineyards and kisses, in honey and pomegranates, in bodies called beautiful without apology. The commentators read the lovers as Israel and God, or Christ and the church, or the soul and its bridegroom. Illuminators follow that path, yet they do not bleach the senses. They let the language stand and crown the moment with emblems of union. Rings, lilies, enclosed gardens, a tower made lovely not for war but for fidelity. Flesh is shown not to inflame, but to anchor allegory. Desire learns its end, not possession, but covenant. Bestiaries and moral glosses add another register. A siren combs her hair on a rock. A mermaid sings to a ship. A unicorn lays its head in a maiden's lap. None of this invites daydreams. The captions bite. Beware vanity. Beware the song that lures timber towards stone. Beware flattery that lowers every guard. When an illuminator frames a sermon with beasts who mimic human folly, he is not muddying doctrine. He is clarifying it by contrast. He paints allegories with fur and fins so that abstractions grow a heartbeat. There is, too, the blunt honesty of medicine and birth. Some devotional books include diagrams, scenes of midwives at their work, women laboring with saints invoked for aid. The images are stark because life is stark. Mothers bleed. Infants arrive violet and wailing. A household holds its breath between prayer and panic. To place such scenes near petitions to the Virgin is not a contradiction. It is a plea that grace descend into rooms that smell of sweat and brine and fear. What seems sensitive to us reads as intercession to them, a request that the holy walk through the door without flinching. Public preaching loved clarity. Mystery plays performed outside church walls showed the boaster, the adulterer, the greedy official, the penitent woman, and the scoffer, so that crowds could read conduct as easily as captions. Manuscripts echoed the stage. They pictured consequence, flames curling around stubborn pride, demons tugging hair, angels lifting those who kneel. If the body appears without garment, it is because the soul is at stake. Better an image that stains memory than a gentle vagueness that slips away by noon. Margins also protect attention. Reading by candle fatigues, the mind drifts. The lips keep moving while the heart goes elsewhere. A jolt in the border, a jester pulling a ladder, a knight tilting at a wind-blown snail, a pair of lovers rebuked by a prophet's ribbon of text, snaps the gaze awake. Startlement returns the eyes to the words. In that sense, even the risque becomes medicinal. A sharp tincture against drowsiness, a drop that stings the tongue and cures wander. No single intention governs every picture. Workshops served patrons, princes, abbesses, merchants, guilds, widows with long prayers and short sleep. Some buyers preferred severity, others asked for a warmer glow. Yet across regions one principle holds. The page is a field where body and doctrine meet without coyness. Artists assume their readers know the difference between depiction and endorsement, between showing and celebrating. They trust a conscience trained by fasting, almsgiving, and confession to sort flame from light. Consider the theology of exposure. Sin hides, truth unveils. Baptism, penance, and judgment are ceremonies of revelation. Water, words, and light laying bare what was concealed. To strip the false is to open a path to mercy. When an artist paints a naked penitent beneath a saint's mantle, he is not humiliating her. He is showing that nothing blocks reception, not even the past. When he paints the tempter with handsome face and scaled feet, he is not toying with scandal. He is documenting how danger often wears a friendly mask, scarcity-shaped pedagogy. Few could own libraries. Many could not read letters, yet they read pictures with acuity. A single book of hours might serve a household for decades, its pages kissed smooth at certain saints' days, its corners darkened by thumbs. Images needed to teach across ages. A child sees colour, an adolescent feels story pull. A widow traces gold halos with a tired finger and finds courage. Sensitive scenes carried layered meanings so that the book could grow with the viewer. Censors existed. Abbots who scraped faces with a knife. Priests who dimmed a limb with a smear of pigment. Yet many pages escaped such edits because makers knew how to place offence inside a net of meaning. A figure may stand unclothed, but a banderole unfurls doctrine above. A column of gloss surrounds the miniature-like counsel. A trellis of lilies climbs the frame, reminding eyes of purity even as they process peril. The composition behaves like a sermon with refrains, raining heat with law and promise. Sometimes the border becomes weather for the soul. Carnival elbows lent, feasts jostle fasts. A pig wears a bishop's mitre to mock hypocrisy while, in the opposite corner, a hermit fends a demon with a psalm. The jests are not random. They police boundaries by breaching them in miniature. A controlled burn that prevents a greater fire. If the viewer laughs, the laugh carries a question. What does this joke reveal about me? Pilgrims carried such pages in memory to shrines where bodies were present in other ways. Bones, hair, cloth. Those encounters were tactile, and manuscripts had prepared them. To kneel before a reliquary after seeing saints painted with wounds and weariness is to know that holiness has weight. Paint makes the weight legible. Prayer makes it bearable. Sensitive detail in the book trains honest reverence at the shrine. Finally, there is light. Gold leaf was not chosen for display alone. When candles flicker, the ground of a miniature seems to breathe. A pool glows. A halo warms. A serpent looks briefly alive. This tremor persuades the heart that the page participates in what it depicts. If the image warns, the warning feels immediate. If it consoles, the consolation arrives like heat on cold fingers. In that trembling, sensitive scenes cease to be gratuitous. They become honest reports from the front where spirit and body meet. So the question softens. These pages are not improper. They are precise. They map appetite, folly, cruelty, tenderness, covenant, and consequence because salvation touches all of these. A manuscript that pretends we are incorporeal would be a lie dressed as piety. The truth is braver. It paints the body and then teaches the soul to look through it, beyond it, toward a beauty that does not scandalize because it is both pure and piercing. The margin laughs, the center prays, and between them, the reader learns to weigh desire with wisdom. If you return to the scriptorium, the monk is still there. He lays gold like dawn along the curve of a shoulder, then cools the shine with a wash the color of riverstone. He does not hurry. He knows a page can outlast empires. He knows one honest picture keeps a conscience awake longer than 1,000 neglected admonitions. When he dots the eye of the serpent and steadies the hand of the penitent, he is not courting scandal. He is telling the truth in a language the century will not forget. The fire in the great hall had burned low, casting only faint flickers of light against the heavy stone walls. Outside, the village slept, but inside a chamber set apart for the newlyweds, a different kind of anticipation stirred. Every wedding feast eventually funneled toward this moment, the private act that was never entirely private, the consummation that carried the burden of family honor and communal judgment. For people of the medieval world, virginity was not only a personal state of being, it was property, proof, and pledge. A bride's purity was a form of currency, and the blood expected on the white linens of her wedding bed was the receipt. That small crimson stain became a symbol far larger than the fragile body that produced it. Families relied on it to prove they had raised a daughter unsullied. Husbands demanded it to confirm their right to claim their bride, and entire communities often waited for its display, whispering rumors or threats if it failed to appear. But here lies the deeper unease. This proof was neither reliable nor universal. The medieval world clung to the belief that blood must appear, yet the biology of women refused to obey that script. Some bled, others did not, for reasons that had nothing to do with chastity. A thin or elastic hymen, past horseback riding, even dancing or simple daily work could render the body unmarked. Still, society was not interested in exceptions. Honor demanded certainty, and blood was appointed as its stand-in, however unjust. The danger of this demand became painfully real in countless households. Imagine the quiet terror of a bride stepping into that chamber, knowing her future balanced on what her body might not provide. For some, desperation led to tricks. Small vials of animal blood hidden among linens, prick of the finger at the right moment. Even mothers or midwives conspiring to create the illusion of the required stain. Where fear ruled, deception often followed, and silence about the truth was passed from generation to generation like an heirloom. Failure to bleed could ignite suspicion strong enough to ruin lives. Records and chronicles whisper of annulments, accusations, and in the worst cases, public shaming or punishment. A bride without evidence risked being branded unfaithful before the marriage had even begun. Entire alliances between noble families could collapse over a single unstained sheet. In this way, the body of a young woman became the battlefield where politics, property, and pride collided. The contradiction was sharp. Religion taught that marriage was sacred and consummation holy. Yet the act itself was transformed into an examination, almost a courtroom drama where blood became the only witness allowed to speak. Priests and preachers reinforced this expectation, weaving sermons that linked virginity with divine approval. To lose it before marriage was to risk the soul. To prove it on the wedding night was to confirm God's blessing. The irony is almost unbearable when viewed through modern eyes. A life, a reputation, even a family's standing could hinge on a few drops of blood. In the shadows of those stone chambers, many brides prayed not for pleasure, not even for love, but simply for evidence. Evidence to shield them from disgrace. At times, entire communities took part in this ritual of surveillance. Some cultures paraded the sheets publicly, hanging them from windows or displaying them in the town square. What should have been private intimacy became a stage where every eye sought confirmation, and gossip sharpened like knives if none was found. Imagine standing at such a threshold, not only beside a new spouse, but beneath the collective judgment of neighbors, relatives, and rivals alike. Beneath all this, an unspoken cruelty lingered. The system rarely considered men's faithfulness. Husbands could approach marriage with mistresses or brothel visits behind them, and no one asked for proof of their chastity. The blood test was a burden laid only upon women, another thread in the wider tapestry of imbalance that defined gender roles in the Middle Ages. But why did this symbol persist with such tenacity? The answer rests in the medieval obsession with lineage. To secure inheritance, to preserve bloodlines, to guard property from illegitimate heirs, families required certainty, or at least the illusion of it. Blood on the sheet became the talisman that promised children would be rightful, estates secure, and alliances unbroken. That stain was never just about virtue, it was about power, wealth, and the fragile scaffolding of social order. Not every bride survived this ordeal unscathed. Some faced rejection, banishment, or worse. Others were forced into humiliating tests, where midwives or matrons examined them in public rituals meant to determine the truth. These practices were less about biology and more about control. Another reminder of how women's bodies were bound into systems of judgment they never designed. And still, stories of resilience emerge. Women learned how to manipulate expectations, how to survive within impossible rules. Behind whispered curtains, mothers taught daughters small secrets of survival, how to endure and still preserve a future. The very silence of those stories becomes testimony, an underground history of women resisting in the only ways they could. As we imagine that chamber with its dim light and heavy air, we are left with a haunting question. Was the blood on the sheet ever really about the body at all? Or was it a theatre staged for the eyes of society, where power wore the mask of purity and fear dressed itself as honor? The air inside a medieval chamber was heavy with silence, though outside the village still murmured with muffled voices and the restless shuffle of feet. Everyone knew what they were waiting for. A single sheet, a scrap of linen, would soon carry the weight of honor, lineage, and survival. To us it might seem absurd, but for families in that world, blood on that cloth was proof that virtue had been preserved. that the marriage was legitimate, and that alliances could be sealed without shame. But what if the night ended with no such sign? What if the bed remained untouched by the crimson trace that custom demanded? This question haunted countless brides and grooms. For the woman, it was a nightmare woven into the fabric of her life, because a body did not always follow the rules set by tradition. Not every first union left behind a mark, and the human body, unpredictable and stubborn, could betray her in front of the eyes of an entire community. Whispers spread quickly. Neighbors speculated, elders frowned, and relatives pressed for explanations. In some towns, the sheet was hung proudly in the morning sun, displayed to all like a banner of triumph. In others, it was folded discreetly, passed hand to hand among midwives or noblewomen who'd been summoned to witness the ritual. The pressure was relentless, and the consequences for failing to produce this fragile evidence were severe. A woman could be accused of deception, of hiding a secret lover, or even of dishonoring the bloodline into which she married. Imagine the terror of a young bride whose body did not provide the expected sign. Her heart raced as her husband stared at the bed, silent, his face torn between confusion and suspicion. Did he dare defend her, or would he join the chorus of voices ready to condemn? In households ruled by fear and rigid codes, men often chose to preserve their own reputation rather than shield their wives. For them, honor was a blade sharper than compassion. What unfolded next was rarely gentle. Some families turned to invasive and humiliating inspections, summoning local healers or matrons to determine whether the bride had indeed been untouched before marriage. These women, often respected in their villages, were both guardians and instruments of cruelty. They peered, prodded, and judged, their word carrying enough force to decide a woman's fate. The so-called test of virginity was neither accurate nor fair, but once declared, it was nearly impossible to refute. The worst consequences came when the absence of blood was treated as proof of betrayal. In courts and noble estates, accusations of infidelity could mean annulment, disgrace, or even death. Stories linger of queens and princesses cast aside, their lives destroyed because a single night failed to produce a stain of red. For peasants, the stakes were no less grim, though punishments often took the form of exile from the community, whispers that never ceased, and children born under the shadow of suspicion. To avoid these dangers, some women and families resorted to desperate measures. Midwives shared secret tricks, passing them through generations as whispered survival tools. A bride might prick her finger and smear the sheet with her own blood. Others used animal blood concealed within tiny bladders or cloths hidden in the bedchamber, ready to be released at the crucial moment. These deceptions carried their own risks, for discovery meant scandal upon scandal. But the alternative, ruin, was even worse. The psychological burden was immense. The night that should have been a private union between two people became instead a public trial, a stage on which the bride's body was forced to perform for an audience that she could neither see nor refuse. Every glance from relatives, every hushed conversation from neighbors pressed down upon her. For men too, there was pressure, though of a different kind. A husband unable to prove his wife's chastity risked being mocked as weak, duped, or dishonored. Masculinity itself was tied to the blood-stained linen. When we look back across the centuries, it is easy to condemn these customs as cruel and senseless. But for those who lived within them, they were as natural as the rising of the sun. Custom was law, and law was survival. It was not just about personal pride, but about inheritance, property, and political alliances. Families feared that without such proof, questions would fester about the legitimacy of heirs. In a world where land and titles meant everything, such doubts could unravel dynasties. Beneath these rigid practices, one can glimpse small rebellions, subtle acts of compassion, and quiet resistance. Some husbands turned away, choosing not to present the sheet at all, shielding their wives from scrutiny. Some mothers whispered advice to daughters about the body's unpredictability, reassuring them that they were not alone. And in rare cases, entire communities seemed to look the other way, choosing peace over spectacle. Still, the anxiety of that night lived on. Imagine lying awake in a dark chamber, the rush of fear louder than the beating of your own heart. Imagine knowing that the fate of your life, your reputation, and your family's honor rested on a trace of blood that might or might not appear. This was the impossible trial faced by countless women, a trial they could neither prepare for nor control. And so, the crimson cloth became more than fabric. It was a symbol of power, control, and fear. It told stories that were not always true but were always believed. And in its silence, in the moments when it remained unstained, it whispered questions that no one dared answer aloud. But what if one morning the sheet told no story at all? What if honor was demanded, but the body refused to comply? What secrets and shadows followed those who carried the shame of a spotless bed? The first light of dawn filtered through the narrow slits of a stone chamber, illuminating the stillness of the room where lives had just been altered. Outside, the world carried on with its routines. Roosters crowed, the smell of bread baked in village ovens drifted through the air, and merchants prepared their stalls. Yet within this chamber, silence lingered heavier than stone walls. For one family, the proof of honor had not been delivered. The linen, folded with anxious hands, lay in a chest, unstained and silent. This absence was not simply a private matter between two people, but a thunderclap that reverberated outward, shaking the fragile network of trust that bound families, neighbors, and allies. In a society where reputation was currency, the spotless sheet was treated like evidence in a trial, and the trial had no defense counsel, no appeals, only judgment. The bride, pale and trembling, often bore the full weight of this failure. In many homes, the first response was accusation. Had she been touched before? Did she carry a hidden past? A lover whose shadow now hovered over this union? These questions were asked not with compassion but with suspicion sharpened into blades. Every silence she offered was twisted into confession, every tear into proof of guilt. The husband stood at a crossroads. For some, loyalty to family outweighed tenderness for a wife they barely knew. A man could declare his bride dishonored, cast her aside, and protect his lineage by separation or annulment. Others, torn by conflicting duties, defended their wives with words that rang hollow against the louder chorus of custom. Rarely did their defense hold long against relentless community pressure. To make matters worse, medieval law often codified these fears. In some regions, the absence of blood was considered grounds for annulling a marriage, the wife branded as deceitful. Families sued one another, dowries were demanded back, and alliances shattered overnight. What began as a private ritual became a public crisis, spreading like wildfire through courts and taverns alike. The spotless sheet became a scandal that no whispered prayer could conceal, and so, desperate remedies flourished. Stories abound of midwives and elder women preparing elaborate deceptions. Animal blood, hidden in tiny bladders, could be released onto linen at the decisive moment. In some cases, herbal mixtures caused minor bleeding, cruelly weaponizing the body itself to mimic what tradition demanded. Such measures were dangerous, humiliating, and yet they gave women a fragile shield against ruin. Still, deception was risky. Discovery meant double disgrace. A woman condemned not only as unchaste, but as a liar. The shame rippled outward, staining her family's name for generations. Thus, the chamber became a place of calculated theatre, where intimacy was secondary to survival, and human bodies were forced into the roles demanded by custom. The tragedy lay in the collision between biology and expectation. Not all women bled on their wedding night. Some never did, through no fault of their own. Others, already injured or physically different, could not produce what society demanded. Science, as we know it now, had no place in medieval explanations. The body was expected to conform, and when it did not, punishment followed swiftly. Imagine the heavy footsteps of in-laws approaching the chamber, faces stern, voices insistent. They demanded the cloth, demanded proof, demanded assurance that their honor had been safeguarded. For the bride, each knock at the door was a hammer blow. For the groom, hesitation meant weakness. And for both, silence was the most damning answer of all. Even religion intertwined with this ritual. Priests preached chastity as divine command, but they too participated in reinforcing social customs. Sermons warned of the dangers of lust, while simultaneously holding up the spotless bride as an ideal of purity. In confessions, women trembled, fearing not only the judgment of men, but also the eternal consequences of heaven and hell. The blood on the sheet became more than a symbol of honor. It was interpreted as a marker of divine approval. And yet, even in the darkest corners of this tradition, there were glimmers of resistance. In whispered conversations, some mothers reassured daughters that love, not blood, defined their worth. Some husbands quietly refused to present the linen, shielding their wives from the gaze of neighbors. A few communities, weary of scandal, allowed private unions without the cruel demand for proof. These rare acts of mercy, though small, remind us that humanity persisted even under oppressive norms. But for the majority, the sheet remained a merciless judge. Imagine waking at dawn, eyes searching desperately for a stain that never came. Imagine the weight of footsteps outside, the hushed murmurs of relatives waiting for news. Imagine knowing that your future might be destroyed by the silence of fabric. That was the reality faced by countless women, whose honor and safety hung by a thread of expectation. And so, in the soft light of morning, the chamber became both sanctuary and prison. For some, the crimson mark brought relief, a sign that life would continue unchallenged. For others, its absence opened a chasm of fear, where every glance carried suspicion, every word whispered behind closed doors cut like a blade. What did it mean to live under such constant scrutiny, where even the most intimate moment was transformed into public theatre? What did it mean to measure purity by a fragile trace of blood? These questions, left unanswered for centuries, linger like shadows over the history of marriage, chastity, and control. The chamber was quiet, though its silence carried echoes of centuries. What began as a single night in the life of a bride and groom had grown into a ritual that spanned kingdoms, shaped customs, and ruled the destinies of entire families. The sheet, so ordinary in its fabric, became extraordinary in its meaning. It bore not only stains of blood, but the weight of fear, honor, and control. The final hours of that night often decided futures more than vows, more than whispered promises beneath candlelight. In a world where honor was everything, where family alliances determined survival, a drop of blood could secure peace. Its absence, however, could shatter reputations and lives. That power made the linen more than fabric. It was transformed into a verdict, one issued without judge or jury, but enforced by all who stood outside the chamber door. As dawn spilled across cobblestone streets and villagers stirred from their homes, eyes always turned toward the house where a marriage had been sealed. Mothers watched windows with anxious hearts. Fathers carried the burden of lineage, and neighbors whispered predictions. What should have been a private union of two souls became instead a stage upon which the body itself was forced to perform. Its role scripted by custom, its outcome broadcast through gossip. Generations of women bore this weight. Some found themselves celebrated, their families uplifted, their names whispered with pride. Others were condemned, branded with shame, even when their bodies had committed no crime. The injustice was as relentless as it was invisible, for no one questioned the ritual's fairness. The spotless sheet spoke louder than truth, louder than innocence. Despite the cruelty, survival often required ingenuity. Mothers taught daughters secret methods, small deceptions that offered protection. Midwives became both healers and accomplices, their knowledge of blood and herbs twisted into tools of survival. A bride pricking her finger to smear crimson onto linen was not committing sin in her own eyes. She was fighting for her life, her dignity, her right to exist without disgrace. These small rebellions, fragile as they were acts of courage in a world that gave women so little choice. For men too, the pressure was real, though of a different kind. A husband's masculinity was judged not by tenderness, but by proof. To fail to produce a stained sheet was to risk humiliation, to be accused of weakness or ignorance. In their silence, many men surrendered to custom, even when their hearts leaned toward mercy. Others defended their wives, though their voices were drowned out by tradition. Some quietly chose to shield their brides, refusing to present evidence at all. These rare gestures reveal the tension between love and honor, between private truth and public expectation. Over centuries, the practice left scars deeper than any blade. It reminded women that their bodies were not their own, that intimacy was never fully private, that even the most sacred moment was subject to judgment. It turned love into performance and trust into proof, and yet, in its cruelty, it also revealed the fragility of human societies, the lengths to which people go to protect reputation, and the desperation that arises when survival is tied to appearances. Now, as we look back across the gulf of time, we may ask, how could something so intimate become so public, so cruelly scrutinized? The answer lies in the nature of power itself. Those who controlled the narrative of honor controlled inheritance, land, and legacy. And so, the sheet became not just cloth but a weapon, silent, cold, unyielding. But history is not only about cruelty, it is also about resilience. For every bride who trembled under the gaze of her family, there was another who outwitted the custom. For every man who chose shame over compassion, there was another who placed love above honor. For every ritual that tried to define purity by blood, there were voices, quiet but steady, that insisted purity was something deeper, something no linen could capture. And so, the story of blood on the wedding night is more than a tale of superstition. It is a window into the human condition, our fears, our need for control, our desperate grasp for certainty in an uncertain world. The sheet may have been silent, but it told stories of pain, of defiance, of survival. And even now, centuries later, its shadow lingers, a reminder of how fragile dignity can be when bound to tradition. If you close your eyes and imagine the chamber, the flickering candles, the tense silence, you can almost hear the heartbeat of those who lived this ordeal. You can sense their fear, their hope, their silent prayers, and perhaps, in understanding their suffering, we also glimpse the resilience that carried them through. This chapter in history forces us to ask difficult questions. What rituals in our own time demand proof at the expense of compassion? What judgments do we still cast upon bodies, demanding they tell stories they were never meant to tell? The past lingers not to shame us, but to warn us, to remind us that the worth of a human being can never truly be measured in stains on a cloth. Thank you for staying with this journey to the very end. If you found this story compelling, if it helped you see the past in a new light, I invite you to subscribe to Sleepy Story, give this video a like, and join us for the next exploration into history's forgotten corners. Your support is the greatest motivation that keeps these stories alive, told softly for those who seek both rest and knowledge in the quiet of the night.